Ladies and gentlemen, assalamu alaikum. Welcome. My name is Arif Usmani. I represent Abu Dhabi Islamic Bank in the absence of my CEO, Mr. Tirad Mahmood, who couldn't be here for unforeseen circumstances. Personally, I'm very privileged to be here as a moderator of this session on government and sovereign sukuks. We have a panel of very qualified presenters as well as a very distinguished panel of experts and scholars. So I'm looking forward, as all of you, to an interactive session on this important topic. Our topic, which is developments in the sovereign sukuk space, is always relevant and is particularly relevant today with many governments in the GCC and the wider MENA region faced with the depreciation of oil prices and the depletion of their reserves. And sukuks are an important source of funding for many sovereigns and have always been and will grow in importance. One of our panel of experts, Dr. Ghaith, has an excellent presentation and makes a strong case for sukuks as a source of funding for new capital expenditure, rather than for existing assets and as a source of refinancing. Obviously, new assets and new capex is an ongoing requirement in developing countries, so it's very relevant. Mr. Murad, our other panelist, presenter, touches on similar issues and gives us a perspective on Turkey's sovereign sukuk market. We are privileged to have a panel of experts to comment on it, and we look forward to questions from the audience. The way we want to run it is the two panelists, presenters will present. Each will take about 25 to 30 minutes, maybe 20, 25 minutes. And then that will take us to about 10:30. And then we'll open it for questions and comments by our distinguished panelists here. We have to have an interactive session. And I wanted to end by give a comment from Mr. Jack Welch, who was the CEO of GE. And he defined leadership as hiring the right people and getting out of the way. So I'm going to go. Thank you. So I'll start with Dr. Ghaith. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, please, yes. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I was asked, let me first thank AAOIFI and the World Bank for their kind invitation for me. Today, my presentation, I will focus on the issue of local currency government sukuk market. And I'm emphasizing the issue of local currency because most of the government sukuk issued around the world nowadays are the sovereign sukuk that are issued in dollar or externally. So let me start. There we go. Now, let me start by a provoking proposition here about the sukuk market. Sukuk market started and continues to have high expectations, but if we look at the reality, the performance was really lackluster. All right. So those who have followed the industry from its early stages in the about 2002, 2003, and I was one of them, at that time the expectation is that by this time the market will be around $1 to $1.5 trillion. And many speeches were made to that effect by experts, by industry advocates. So where we are right now, if we look at this is the latest numbers that we have for all the sukuk issued globally. Roughly about 100 billion to 120 billion are issued a year in recent years. Cumulatively, everything issued since 2001 barely exceeds 700 billion, which is far, far cry from what we expected, everybody expected to have a long time ago. And that is more so problematic if we compare it, let's say, to the growth on the banking assets. As you can see in the chart, the banking assets have exceeded by now well over $1.5 trillion. So when you compare the performance of sukuk market to banking, Islamic banking performance, you can see quite a marked difference, highlighting the underdevelopment of the Sukuk market. And the picture is even more difficult when we look at the regional nuances. If we look at the distribution of Sukuk by currency, we see the vast majority, like the good majority of them, 55% of them are issued in Malaysian ringgit versus the rest of the other currencies. And for a variety of reasons, the Malaysian experience has not been replicated that much outside Malaysia. And for that reason, if we factor that in, the global Sukuk performance is even more lackluster than expected. And this is even, if you look at it from a regional distribution, we add Southeast Asia, which includes the issuance of Sukuk by Malaysia and others in local currency and in dollars. That's almost over 60%. So outside Malaysia, the growth of the industry has been really not very disappointing, I would say, for many observers. So why is that? There are a couple of factors. We've heard before, and we continue to hear continuously about the reasons for this underdevelopment of the market, be it legal problems, difficulty on the Sharia side, and so on and so on. But let me put two propositions here that could really explain, in my opinion, many of the problems that this industry has faced. The first one is what we call the Sukuk market design infrastructure tension. This is a tension between what do we design and what kind of infrastructure we need to build to support the issuance of Sukuk. And the other one is the true lack of attention to developing the local currency government Sukuk market. These two factors, if we think about carefully, are the most fundamental factors that resulted in the underperformance and continue to result in the underperformance of Sukuk market and create many of the problems that we are struggling with it right now. So let me go quickly over some of those issues. Now, if we want to discuss what is the design infrastructure tension, we should really take a look into the market conditions for Sukuk. So what do we see in the market conditions? We all are aware of the substantial demand gap that exists in that market, a huge demand gap, whether it is demand for instruments by investors, by institutions, or demand for funding for those who want to raise funding through Sukuk. And that is a tremendous demand, as we've seen with the few Sukuk that we issued and the demand and the subscription for them. On top of that, conditions like liquidity conditions and regulatory pressures have created additional pressures to issue Sukuk and develop the Sukuk market. Now, anyone who is looking at this picture will see immediately a great opportunity to make a profit. This is clear, and that's why many people are going into that industry. If you are in that industry and you are saying this one, and you have this new instrument, and it's a new financial innovation, and like any new financial innovation, you need to make it work for the market. You need to find a way to bring it to market. And that way did not exist at that time. So if you are in that market, you are faced with two choices. Either jump on the opportunity and be opportunistic. And in this case, what do? I can issue immediately my Sukuk using the conventional market infrastructure. That was one option. Or I can switch, delay my issuance, and work on the infrastructure, being a bit more strategic, and invest in building up the necessary new infrastructure. These are the choices that faced the industry early on and still faces the industry right now. Where do we put our resources? Do we put them in the design of the instrument to make it adaptable to the conventional finance infrastructure and go ahead and quickly issuing it, supposedly? Or shall we invest in a new infrastructure that is needed for this new instrument? Now, I think all of us, we know where the industry, for the most part, turned to. They opted for the opportunistic part of the choice. And that is understandable. There's lots of profit to be made. There are needs that immediate need that to be made. However, this choice, unfortunately, as we have seen, had an adverse impact on the development of the Sukuk market. Not only that, but also on the broader Islamic financial industry. And I will explain why this happened. So what happened? What is the adverse impact that came out of this? Now, since I have to take this new instrument, and I need at the same time to issue it, but using the conventional financial infrastructure, I have no choice but to find a ways to adapt these new instruments to fit the conventional infrastructure market. So that means, by default, whether you needed it or not, you end up creating complex structures to transform sukuk to not necessarily by substance, but functionally at least, to resemble conventional financial instruments in order to be able to use the conventional financial infrastructure. In this case, what ended up with is creating complex SPVs, moving into asset-based structures, and even nowadays some are moving into asset-indexed structures, adapting an existing asset model where basically this is the sale, lease, buyback. This is becoming the dominant model, moving into tawarruq and many other issues, sometimes a combination of these issues. Many times when I look at these structures, I really feel for our fuqaha and the difficulty they are facing, because this is what the industry is telling them, that is, this is what we have, this is what, there is no option, find a solution for us. Well, that is not exactly true. That was a choice that was made early by many of the people in that industry. Now, for that, the consequences of that, when you have such a complex instrument, then your sukuk is no longer a common or plain vanilla instrument. They are exotic. This is what we call exotic sukuk. These are designer sukuk. And these have specialized market. It's not open to everybody because you need to understand them. You need the lawyers. You need months to put the documentation for that. And this is what we call exotic markets. It also, there were significant Sharia issues coming out of it. Some of it resolved, some of it is not resolved. Some of it continues to linger around. Doubts linger around. What they did also, and it created substantial legal ambiguity. And the legal risks were non-trivial. Anyone who was involved in a resolution of a default in a sukuk will know how complex the legal issues are. And many times you end up with legal outcome that was never intended in the first place. And because it is exotic, because it is all of these, it's difficult to produce. And we've listened yesterday to my colleague, Brother Ansari, when he said that it took me, timing is everything. It took me 6 months to put together a sukuk issuance, and then timing is no longer appropriate, which means the industry has not been able to issue these sukuk in large numbers on a regular basis. And that undermined the market development. The most critical, actually, in my view, consequence of that choice that was made by the industry, it misdirected what kind of reforms we need to do to build up the infrastructure. The focus moved into areas that is not where it should be. And I will discuss those in a minute. But this is really a critical consequence of that choice. Let me move to the government securities market. So we discussed a little bit this, what we call the design and infrastructure tension. In a nutshell, where do you focus? Do you jump quickly into the market and put your resources in trying to design and do financial engineering for the instrument? Or you try to issue simple, plain vanilla instrument, but you need really to invest in the infrastructure that will support the issuing it. That is the tension that exists in the market. The other issue that undermined the development of the market is lack of attention, as I said, to the local currency government sukuk market. So why government securities market is important? It is very important, and that importance goes beyond the fiscal. And this is an issue that many countries that have surplus or balanced budget have faced. Why should we issue sukuk? We don't need the money. Well, the issue here goes beyond the fiscal, far beyond, actually, the fiscal. Let me quickly take you through the steps. So if you want an effective and active, efficient government sukuk market, if you have that kind of market, what is the results? One of them, your financial market will deepen. We've seen this everywhere. Furthermore, this will strengthen the banking system. Banks will manage their liquidity better. They will manage their risks better. So that strengthens the banking system. Not only this, but the conduct of monetary policy becomes far more efficient. So all of those really depends on having active and efficient government securities market in general. Where does that take you? That means you can mobilize the financial system, can mobilize more savings, can improve risk management, can improve the capital investment allocation. All of these lead to positive externalities on economic growth. This is standard. This is 101 finance. Now, all of that comes to the first connection, to the first arrow. That first arrow, these markets create the benchmark for the rest of the financial system. And that benchmark is benchmarking the price, but benchmarking also the risk, and benchmarking the design. Once these benchmarks are established, then the financial system can move on and develop. Same thing applies if you want to develop the government sukuk market. It has to go through these processes, and you need that active market to support the rest of the economy. Not only this, but the sukuk has an added value, I will discuss in a minute also, that it could, by its nature, if it's done properly, could provide certain level of protection for priority social and development government spending that conventional bonds may not offer. So we have, why then the sukuk market did not develop? What were the factors that undermined the development of the local currency government sukuk market? First of all, it wasn't on anybody's radar attention. It was an afterthought for many governments. I haven't seen any country, very few, actually there are a few exceptions, where the issuance of the sukuk was part of a strategic program to develop the local government currency market. And that is very critical because issuing the sukuk has to be done in context. It is not simply an instrument to raise money, but it has to be done in context. And that is very critical to market development. And they are not formulated usually in the context of public debt management. So if, as a government, if I don't have an instrument that I can use it to manage my liability as a government properly, effectively, that instrument is no good to me. I should not use it. The objective is not simply to issue an instrument. There is far broader economic objectives that need to be enforced. Now, not only that, but most of the time, and this is the opportunistic part of issuing government sukuk, most of these sukuk are issued in foreign currency, and they are really issued for balance of what we call for balance of payment purposes. They were issued to raise reserves, to borrow reserve to the country, not necessarily to develop the sukuk market. And unfortunately, they mimicked the private sector sukuk. They used the same structure, same concepts, which is very strange because nowhere else a government uses corporate debt structures to issue their own debt because the corporate debt structure, private debt structure is complex. It has had its own specific nuances, whereas what the government needs is quite different. That didn't happen here. In fact, there was the same people who were advising corporations how to issue their sukuk, and they are advising the government how to issue their sukuk. Finally, across the board, with very few exceptions, there was hesitation to develop the infrastructure. And that is really a reflection of everything above that, the lack of strategy, the lack of purpose, the focus on developing the market for objective other than the fiscal. When you have all of these factors there, your sukuk market will not develop, no matter what you do. It needs to be factored in. So, what do we need to develop a government securities market? And I'm not talking about sukuk here, securities market in general. You need a simple design, plain vanilla. This is the benchmark for the rest of the financial system. You cannot have a government instrument that is complex. It just doesn't work. So any design issued for government security, whether it's a bond or a sukuk, has to be a simple design, plain vanilla design. If it is issued, you have to have the capacity to issue it on a regular basis, what we call program issuance or schedule issuance. If your design does not support a regular issuance on a schedule, that design is not good. Similarly, if it doesn't support volume issuance, that design is not good. You cannot use it. These are important design considerations. You have to issue it obviously in different maturities. on market term, but most importantly, and I keep repeating this, you have to be able to integrate it in how you manage your liability as a government. It has to be integrated in the public debt management strategies. All of these apply to the government bonds market, but they are also equally apply if you want to develop the government sukuk market. Now, for the sukuk, however, we have a few more things that need to be in place. Obviously, they have to comply with the general principle of issuing securities and Islamic finance, and that goes without saying. The second one, it has to be truly asset-backed. We'll discuss the issue here. If it is not, it is creating significant distortions in the market, in the design and the market, and we've seen that through the tension between the design and infrastructure. Most importantly, it will need supportive infrastructure, and I will define in a minute what we mean by supportive infrastructure. So, if I want to issue securities, what options I have? I will go very quickly on the options we have. There are two classes of instrument, and this is coming from our experience. We have been advising countries for over 15 years now. There are two classes of instruments. You can issue what we call musharaka or participation papers, or we issue what we call now sukuk. I'm just trying to define what is that. For musharaka paper, these are instruments usually issued against either a pool of government ownership in profitable state-owned companies. We have in Sudan a good example of that. Or it can be issued against direct equity participation in a specific project. Iran produces a number of these instruments. Now, these instruments can raise funding for the government, but they are not particularly suited for government funding because the cost is unknown here, and you cannot really manage your liability very well as a government or program and budget, prepare your budget properly because you don't know what is the ultimate cost to you. So these things are useful, but not terribly the kind of thing that you need for government. Now, for sukuk, they can issue it against a pool of existing government physical assets. This is the dominant form by far. Or it can be issued based on a commodity structure. Few countries doing it, not many. This is the least common. Or you can issue it to finance development and capital spending, or what we call the acquisition or creation of new assets. And that is very critical. For the purpose of this presentation, for the remainder of my presentation, obviously we'll focus on the sukuk and the first and the last types of these sukuk. On the existing asset sukuk, you are all familiar with it. Everybody knows it. It is basically issued against government physical assets that are sold to an SPV, leased back with a repurchase clause at some time in the future and maturity date, often at par price, but maybe sometimes at a different agreed to price. So this is the common structure. But what does that do? It can be issued actually in different maturities. We've seen different instruments issued in different maturities. However, as we've seen in the private sector sukuk, the design here is complex. We have multiple embedded contracts in this one. Sometimes we have multiple embedded SPVs. I've seen structures where you have one or two or three SPVs embedded in inside each other. And this is a critical one. It is really cumbersome. Would require cumbersome legal and accounting procedure. You have to change laws because most countries, if not all of them, does not allow the government to sell its assets outright, or at least without returning back to the parliament, authorizing them to do that. Not only this, but there's also another factor that people don't pay attention to it. Many times, government assets are not owned by one entity. Sometimes they are owned by, dispersed across all government units. So if you want to take assets from this unit to that asset of this unit, how is it going to do that from accounting point of view? That could create big problems. Actually, one of the big reasons that stopped the UK from issuing sukuk many years ago, not the recent one, is the accounting side, not the legal side. They could not figure out how we can move these assets across units. So these are non-trivial, and the hurdles could be very prohibitive. On the legal side, government were forced to go through an extended period of time, years in some countries, to change the laws. And if you recall earlier in my presentation, I said the choice of the industry made misdirected the needed reform. And this is one of the areas where the reform were misdirected. Instead of focusing on building the proper infrastructure, we are telling the government, change your laws. And I can assure you that is absolutely not necessary for most cases. Syria concern continues. We discussed that. But from government perspective, from a debt management perspective, there are limitations on volume. And that limitation on volume simply reflects the limitation on how much assets the government is willing to put into this program. Sometimes the assets are available, but politically, it is not possible to use them. So there are many reasons where you have these limitations. You cannot simply have a land in the open and keep repeating it. Sometimes they do, but many times you can't. There are many limitations. And that's why, with very few exceptions, most government scope issuance programs are one-off or dispersed. Very difficult to see a case where they keep repeating the issuance on a regular basis across the maturity curve. So let's go to the new assets. Now, in this case, the sukuk are not issued using existing assets. They are simply issued, the fund raised through the sukuk are issued to fund and finance the government acquisitions of new assets, meaning the government development program, the government capital procurement, and even social spending, because part of the social spending create real assets as well. Now, the design is extremely simple. You have one SPV for all government issuance needs, open-end fund, type of fund, where the funds, the SPV issues the sukuk on one side at different maturities on a regular basis. On the other hand, on the other side, the assets are being created continuously because the government, the assets that are created by the government is limitless. Every year they have development expenditure and capital procurement. There are no complex contracts. We use simple ijara contract, simple murabaha contract, simple ju'ala, service contract. The standard contract that the fuqaha approved, nothing complex about them. What's more important, it does not raise any legal issues. Why it doesn't raise any legal issues? Every government around the world, by default, engage in lease transactions. Nobody prohibits any government. There are no laws anywhere in the world that says government cannot lease assets. There is no law around the world where the government says, where it says that the government cannot buy on credit, murabaha. There is no law around the world that says the government cannot contract subcontractor to do services for them. This is a normal part of government business. So you don't need, if you are engaging in these transactions to generate these assets, you don't need to change any laws, actually. And from our experience, we haven't seen any major Sharia issues, and I will be happy to discuss this further as we go. Since the government needs for development spending and need for capital procurement, which is continuous every year, sometimes these two items constitute 1/3, if not more, of the government budget. It means you have limitless access to assets. If you have limitless access to assets, then you can support issuance of large volumes. Not only this, but you can do it across the whole maturity curve. The drawback, not everything is good. There is a price. The price, it would require a new infrastructure, and that is where the crux of the matter is. The new infrastructure is not changing the laws. The new infrastructure is really changing how you do business in the government. So, what kind of institutional adjustment we need to support this new simple model that can achieve all the objectives that we said early in the presentation on the government sukuk market? Now, two areas that we'll focus on: the way the budget is formulated and executed, and the way the treasury operates. And you can see here there are no structures, no arrows going right and left. And we're not talking even about design. How the government is going to operate, whether it is in putting up its budget or in operating its treasury. On the budget process, Now, since these sukuk are going to be issued to finance the acquisition of new assets, it supports the implementation of the budget. It means that when I formulate my budget, as a budget officer, I have to identify the line item on my development budget, on my capital procurement, that will be targeted, that will be purchased, executed through the fund raised by the sukuk. So if I want to buy computers, these computers are going to be funded by the sukuk, so to have to mark them. That doesn't happen right now. Right now, it's simply the budget is put together. These are the spending side, and the people who do the revenue raising do it on their own, and then things work out through the treasury. But in this case, no. You have, ahead of time, you have to identify these assets. Now, to do that, you need obviously better planning, better coordination between the spending unit and those who are raising the fund, because you want to make sure, as a Ministry of Education, that if you want to buy your computers on September every year, that this is closely coordinated with those who want to raise the fund for you to buy these computers. So you need a better planning and better coordination in the execution of budget development and procurement budget. You need a new institutional arrangement to link the sukuk financing to the spending on the underlying assets. Remember, under Islamic finance, there is no financing until there is spending. There is no murabaha contract until you purchase the assets that are financed by murabaha. Then at that moment, you have your murabaha contract. But then how do you do this? You need a new arrangement, meaning communication and reporting line. That doesn't exist right now. This is part of the new infrastructure. And then you need to closely prioritize and monitoring the acquisition of new assets funded by the sukuk. And that monitoring and reporting is an additional thing that needs to be done to ensure that the budget process is supportive of the issuance. Now, that is on the budget process and on the execution. But then, that is not the whole story, because we need to also look at how the Treasury operates. Now, here, let me give it to you in a nutshell. In a conventional Ministry of Finance operations, there is no link between spending and funding. As a Ministry of Education, I have my budget. I was told I can spend X amount on computer. I go ahead, I order the computer from the vendors, and I send the bill to the Treasury. That's all, that's it. My role is over, complete. The Treasury's role here is to do what? Is to go and see if there are tax revenue, they will collect it and use it to pay. If there isn't, they will issue bonds to do it. So there is no connection between the spending and the funding. However, here we have a little bit more complex relationship. We have an SPV now, not only the Treasury, but the SPV. It becomes part of the Treasury operation, not necessarily part of the Treasury, but part of the Treasury operation of the whole government. And that operation will need to make sure that the project or the purchases are executed in a timely manner through the issuance of sukuk. And that is not a small feat. It takes an effort to put that infrastructure in place. However, if you do that, you are not only going to support the development of your deep and efficient capital market, sukuk market, but it turned out from our experience also that there are side benefits to that. Now, because you have to improve your budget, how you plan your budget, the way you program your capital spending, it improved actually, because those who are doing it started talking to each other in a better ways than they have done before. It also helped implementation of the government development projects. Why is that? Because there is a secondary layer of monitoring. That secondary layer of monitoring, not only the government, but the sukuk SPV and the sukuk holders, because you need to make sure that the schools you built through the issuance of sukuk are actually built. And that has to be reported to the SPV and from that to the wider investor community. And it turned out to be that it may give some protection for development and social program. Why? Because if you want to cut, if you have a situation where you have to cut your budget, now, if you want to cut these development and social programs, since they are tied to the sukuk you are issuing, then you are cutting your sukuk. You cut your program, you cut your financing. So you are bound by trying to keep these programs alive to make sure that the financing coming in. So it may provide you with some protection for your development and social programs. So let me quickly compare the two structures together. 2 minutes, I'm finished. Now, in terms of issues between the two, clearly, as we discussed, there are legal and Sharia issues that has not been fully resolved when it comes to existing asset. Hardly there are no issues that comes out using a new asset model. When it comes to design and infrastructure, the design is more complex in existing asset, which means that you don't need new infrastructure. It is complex because you are using existing infrastructure. The other way around for the new asset model. Asset availability for the existing structure is very limited. It is unlimited for new asset model. In terms of, because it is unlimited, then you can issue, regularly issue the sukuk and in large volume as well. You can issue in different maturities, both of them. Market terms, both of them. Predictable cost, both of them. So on one hand, in the previous page, we've seen factors that are not good for the government debt management and debt strategy. It undermines that. Here, on the other hand, we see factors from the existing asset model that may be useful for that. Overall, you cannot conduct an effective debt management, liability management with existing asset model, where you can do that very well and easily in new asset model. Market liquidity, market deepening are very limited or non-existing for existing sukuk, which means if you want to use informal monetary policy, not terribly useful because you don't have the depths for that. All of these issues are non-issue for the new assets model. Finally, this is a very important point also, sorry. Benefit to the budget. So when you issue sukuk, what do you get? If I'm issuing existing asset sukuk, I'm getting cash. If I'm issuing a new asset sukuk, I'm getting assets. The assets are transferred to the government. Can I get cash out of it? Maybe, yes, but in large part, I'm getting cash. Is there a focus on development, focus on social spending when it comes to existing assets, like bonds? You cannot, no, it's money that came to the same pot and distributed wherever it goes. But here they are targeting for specific spending, and that is mostly development and social spending. What is the conclusion here? Strategic focus should be really on building up new assets, sukuk infrastructure, to develop deep and liquid sukuk market. Can we use existing assets, the one that we are using right now? Maybe, if necessary, if you are under pressure, but there is a risk. The risk to that is you undermine sukuk market development and you confuse the market. That risk does exist. Now, as you've seen right now from my presentation, I did not give you complex, I did not focus on the design. I just tried to explain what is needed from the government point of view to issue a simple design. I think Sudan has done pioneering work on that front, and they have been issuing now for 10 years. There are issues, problems, yes, but this worked very well. I remember very well, and maybe I can discuss that in the presentation. We can discuss what kind of Sharia issues that came out or legal issues in the question and answer, and I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good morning to all of you. Welcome to my presentation. Before starting my presentation, I would like to thank the organizers that give us this chance to share our views and thoughts on Islamic finance. Today, I will present you about sovereign sukuk and Turkey's experience. I divided my presentation into 3 parts. In the first part, I will talk about the market overview, investor profile of sovereign sukuk issuances, and the importance of sovereign sukuk for a country. In the second part, I will talk about the challenges for sovereign sukuk issuances. And in the last part, I will speak on a case study, Turkey's experience. I added this into my presentation because I was actively participated this process while I was working at Government of Turkish Treasury. So I hope that it will give us some beneficial insights about the process itself and the importance of sukuk for a country. Let me start with the first part of my presentation, which is about sukuk market overview. In this slide, we see the global sukuk issuances since 2008, but all we are aware that sukuk became a global phenomenon since 2001. In 2001, total global sukuk issued amount was actually 1.2 billion US dollars. But as the end of 2014, it reached 120 billion US dollars. It corresponds to 100-fold increase. When we look at the main drivers of this increase, we see that there are 4 reasons. The first one is the increasing familiarity of sukuk among market participants. The other one is ample liquidity in Islamic financial institutions. The third one is increasing interest from non-Muslim countries. And the last one is increasing standardization of some types of sukuk structures. And when we focus on the graph, we see that there are 3 important years actually. The first one is 2012. It seems an outlier because of the strong EM inflows. And the second one is 2014. We see a slowdown in the market because of the Malaysian market slowdown. But in 2014, we have an important development for sukuk markets because we see new entrants into the market, which are non-regular and non-Muslim countries, actually. These are UK, Hong Kong, Luxembourg, and UK. Let me look at the last one. And South Africa. And also we have Senegal and Maldives in this year. When we look at this year's development, we see a huge drop in sukuk market. There are 3 reasons actually in the reports. The first one is based on Malaysian market because Bank Negara stopped its short-term sukuk issuances and it affects market significantly. The other one is the difficult conditions in GCC region due to the low oil prices. And the third one is US Fed increase uncertainty regarding US Fed rates. And after giving the brief information about the market overview, let's look at the investor profile of sovereign sukuk. In the first table, we see that institutional investors for international sovereign sukuk are concentrated in Middle East and Asia. Actually, nearly 75% of the sukuk sold to these regions. I am speaking for these case studies. And in the second table, we see an interesting thing, which is that for the same issue, a much larger percentage of sukuk is placed in Middle East and Asia than conventional bonds. Let's look at the let's look at the Turkey case. For Turkey, government of Turkey cannot sell anything to Middle East and Asia with conventional bond issuances. But it sells nearly 70% of sukuk to these regions, and it shows us that how sukuk is an efficient and strong instrument in order to broaden the investor base for a country. In the third table, we see that much of the demand for international sukuk comes from Islamic banks. Interestingly, many large investment funds do not purchase the sukuk. Well, let's look at the importance of sovereign sukuk for a country. Firstly, it helps to establish a reference curve, a yield curve. We all know that sovereign sukuk are priced via using conventional bond yield curve. But if you want to develop domestic sukuk market, you need to have your own sukuk yield curve. In order to have sukuk yield curve, you need to do more regular and predictable issuances in the market. And if you have a yield curve, it encourages the development of domestic sukuk market because it will become a benchmark for corporate and financial institutions' sukuk issuances. And it provides high-quality securities as collateral to secure financial transactions, which helps directly to the development of Islamic interbank markets. Overall, it facilitates the development of a legal framework that would support Islamic financial services. And this brings me to the second part of my presentation, which is about the challenges for sovereign sukuk issuances. I divided these challenges into 3 parts. The first part is about issuer, the supply side considerations. When we look at these considerations, the first thing is asset availability, asset ownership for issuing sukuk, because it becomes somehow problematic for governments to transfer the ownership of sovereign assets to investors or to SPV, particularly if they are non-citizens. And the debate regarding asset-backed versus asset-based is at the center of this question. If you have an asset-based structure, you do not need to transfer fully the ownership of the underlying asset. So governments and corporates prefer this type of issuances. According to the data, 95% of the sukuk are asset-based. But once you have an asset-based structure, there are some other problems. If the structure is asset-based, sukuk are described as unsecured, and this contradicts the claim of purchase and ownership in Sharia rulings. There are some discussions on it. The second consideration is limitations of physical assets. Sometimes it is very hard for a government to find unencumbered physical Sharia-compliant assets to use for issuing sukuk. If it is not possible in all cases, sovereigns may not issue sukuk on a regular and predictable basis. And it hampers the development of the domestic sukuk market, because if you don't have predictable and regular sukuk issuances, you do not have any yield curve, sukuk yield curve, so it impedes the development of local sukuk markets. The third consideration is about alignment of finance and economic activities. It has been discussed yesterday that some structures does not align sukuk issuance with economic activities. It's a problem of actually in terms of maqasudu Sharia and aim of the Sharia problem. Hence the financing and the economic activities are, if disconnected, this may lead to unproductive build-up of debt. And the last concern for the governments is credit rating. The better the credit rating, the lower the funding costs. It is simple. Rating for the asset-based structures totally depends on the credit quality of the underlying obligor, the issuer, the government. But if you use an asset-based structure, the rating will depend in part on value of the underlying assets. Let's look at the demand side considerations, investor side considerations. It is very important for a government to attract institutional investors to its sukuk issuances. It helps to broaden the investor base, but some steps need to be taken for this purpose. The first one is issuer and investor education. The second one is developing Islamic risk management tools and monetary markets, establishing relevant benchmarks for comparison, because investors want to see their performance while investing in these securities, and strengthening the supervision and practices related to price transparency, dissemination, and valuation. And the last one is promoting investors' awareness and literacy. These are very important in order to broaden the investor base and to attract institutional investors. And the second thing is developing domestic sukuk markets. As the Dr. Jihad talked about it, I don't want to focus on it in details, but in the table we see that the countries that have domestic sukuk in their market, many countries wish to develop their domestic sukuk market, but it requires also some basic needs. For example, basic preconditions for securities market must be established. A genuine motivation for using non-conventional instruments such as sukuk must be there. Domestic Islamic financial investors, you need to have this kind of investors. And sukuk cannot stand alone, but should and will grow together with other Islamic financial institutions and services. It's a problem of Islamic ecosystem. You need to have Islamic ecosystem in order to develop your domestic sukuk market. And the third consideration is regarding the infrastructure or the enabling market environment considerations. We can add a lot of things under this heading, but I only choose two of them, which are well known by all of you. The first one is liquidity. In sukuk market, we have limited liquidity because of the lack of standardization, as very talked about, limitations on sukuk tradability, and the buy and hold type of investors. And the other important thing is investor protection, insolvency and governance. Weak default resolution and insolvency regimes hinders the development of the sukuk market actually. It is true for government and domestic market also. For international issuances, it is not a big problem because of the English law. Every sukuk issuance is issued based on English law. But for domestic sukuk issuances, especially for sovereigns, it is important to be clear and to be transparent in terms of event of default case. And restrictions against transfer of government assets, I have already talked about it. And the third one is sukuk governance. In terms of both corporate governance and Sharia governance, it's very important. And I move on the third part of my presentation, which is the government of Turkey experience. Before 2012, government of Turkey didn't have any legal background, legal infrastructure in order to issue sukuk. But in June 2012, the Public Finance and Debt Management Law was amended to enable the sovereign to Turkey to access the sukuk market. This law allows for the establishment of public asset leasing companies. It is SPV. And also the sovereign is able to transfer public assets to the asset leasing company in the sale and leaseback model. And assets held by the central government, state-owned enterprises, and local administrations can be used. And it allows the asset leasing company to issue lease certificates both in local and international capital markets. And lastly but not least, tax regime was set in a similar fashion to conventional sovereign issuances. After this amendment, Turkey achieved to issue 10 sukuks in the market. 3 of them belong to domestic market and the international market and in USD terms, and the 7 of them issued in domestic markets in TL terms. When we look at the TL domestic issuances, we see that all have 2 years maturity. And on the international side, the maturities are varied, but averagely it has 7-year maturity. Last year, Turkey achieved to issue 10 years maturity sukuk. It is very important for a government to issue longer-term bonds in order to manage its debt profile effectively and efficiently. So sukuk gives this opportunity to government. And when we look at the total issued amount, it is nearly $8 billion. As a case study, Turkey's first USD sukuk issuances is shown in the slide. It is done in 2012 with the ijara structure. The important thing is that it is priced inside the Republic's established conventional curve. It means that it is more cheaper for the government to issue sukuk rather than issue conventional bonds. It gives a huge advantage for the government, to the government. And also it provides diversification in terms of investor base, because new pockets of Islamic and conventional liquidity across both Middle Eastern and Asian investors come to the issue. I have talked it about in the previous slide, but we see that the Middle East and Asia portion is nearly 70% when we look at the regional breakdown of the investors. And also it set benchmarks. The firstly set an international benchmark in terms of size and pricing. It set a benchmark for future Republic issues, and it set a benchmark for Turkish private and public sector sukuk issues. When we look at the investor type, we see that the banks got the biggest portion, and then asset management companies comes the next. After this slide, let's look at the implications of Turkish case. What are the gains of government of Turkey by issuing sukuk? There are a lot of gains actually. Firstly, it helped the government to diversify its toolkit of financial instruments. It gained access to new markets and new group of investors, and it reduces overall funding costs and set a pricing benchmark for other sovereign and corporate sukuk issuances. And also it underpinned the development of the insurance sector with regards to alternative investment instruments, such as tekafül products and private pension system. and it contributed to the development of Islamic capital markets. What are the other governments can learn from Turkish experience? When we look at this site, there are lots of lessons can be learned. In designing and implementing a Sukuk program, early planning is important because it's a time-consuming process. You need to have a strategic plan. And the coordination among various agencies and stakeholders is crucial because government organization is a little bit different than the corporate organization. Sometimes you think that the asset is owned by Treasury, but it is owned by other government agencies, or you need to go to register agency. These are all stakeholders in the system, so you have a good coordination with them. And the other thing is improving the awareness of stakeholders is vital. And lastly, a long-term perspective is beneficial. For example, in Turkish case, the government of Turkey thinks that beginning with the ijara structure is good at the beginning stage, but it wants to issue some istisna and some infrastructure sukuk in the middle term. So it is better to have a long-term perspective while making a sukuk issuance on behalf of a government. Thank you. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention and listening.
We'll open it up for questions and answers. Mr. Ahmed will lead the panel's views.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أفضل المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. First of all, I would like to congratulate AAOIFI on the 25 years of celebrations, and also to mention that the father of the sukuk, which is we learned sukuk from him, Dr. Hussein Hamid Hassan. I would like also to mention that I learned the meaning of sukuk from him, and I worked with him closely. It was an honor to work with him closely on issuing sukuk and also establish legal framework, sukuk law and executive regulation for sukuk worldwide, and we learned a lot. And all the Sharia scholars, they contribute to the sukuk industry and the Islamic finance industry for the last 40 years. I would like to start here first with general comments before I go to the presentation on the sukuk market. For the last 25 years of issuing sukuk, I think if you look at the today sukuk outstanding, how it looks like. The characteristics of today outstanding sukuk looks like that more than 80% of the sukuk, outstanding sukuk today is domestic sukuk, not an international. And it's a sovereign more than corporate. If you see today the outstanding sukuk, outstanding profile is almost 18% represent corporate sukuk, and the rest between quasi-sovereign and sovereign. This is give us a message. Also, one of the presentation here mentioned that the sukuk issued in US dollar represents 30% of the total outstanding sukuk, and the rest in local currencies. And as per my colleague, Dr. Sami Suwailam, always he say that last 25 years, the structure of the sukuk, it was always based on a quick fix or quick win, the needs, because it was always driven by corporate, not sovereign. And sovereign always, government always used to be trapped by the structure has been prepared by corporate, because there is a difference between the needs of corporate and the sovereign. Looking at the position of the sukuk worldwide today, we can see that there is a big need to look at the new structure for sovereign sukuk, as mentioned by Dr. Ghiyas in his presentation, to serve the sustainable and to contribute to the sustainable development and to bring sukuk to the original objectives and original needs of having such a sukuk. Sukuk should contribute always to the sustainable development and to create new assets. I don't see sukuk as just a financial instrument for liquidity management. It can be, and it should be there. But without having an Islamic ecosystem I think we will not be able to have this instrument in the right place. If we look for the 25 years of how we structure Sukuk, we started from asset-backed Sukuk, asset-based Sukuk, then we moved to the blended Sukuk, always quick fix based on the needs. Then hybrid Sukuk, and then after Basel II, we came with the perpetual Sukuk. So always the corporate-driven, the industry, not more than the sovereign. While, as we are mentioning, the real needs is towards sustainable development and real development of new assets. Because of that, I think we failed for the last 25 years to have a benchmark for Sukuk industry. I think always we are asking ourselves why we don't have till today a benchmark for a Sukuk market, comparing to the treasury or the bonds or the conventional bonds. So we have to concentrate more towards having this instrument again back to be an equity-driven more than debt-driven. Today, as also the outstanding profile of the Sukuk today, more than 65% is a debt-driven Sukuk, while the rest is equity-driven. And also the holder of Sukuk or Sukuk holders are always keeping the Sukuk in their hands, regardless is it tradable or not, because there is a real demand and all the financial institutions, existing Islamic financial institutions, in a bad need or even conventional to keep such an instrument in their financials. We need to develop the Islamic ecosystem to be able to enhance the needs and the performance of the Sukuk as a financial instruments toward sustainable development. If we go through the presentation given by our colleagues here today, we can see that the both presenters indicated in their presentation that there is a trend, the trend of the Sukuk issuance, including sovereign Sukuk, is slowing down or declining, especially in the year 2015. And the slowing down of the Sukuk may be mainly towards the low price of the commodity of today, and also the slowing on the world economy. In Dr. Ghias' presentation, he mentioned the existing, he gave all the challenges and the obstacles that we are facing today in the model and the current profile of the Sukuk globally, how it looks like, and laid down several issues and the challenges in the existing sovereign Sukuk infrastructure. Towards the end of his presentation, he was presenting or proposed to have a new model shifting towards the development of the Sukuk model and the infrastructure. I think he missed something very important here, and I would like him to share with us the importance of the Islamic ecosystem, because we cannot just develop the market and enhance the regulatory and make everything without having a proper Islamic ecosystem in place. Talking about Islamic banks, the role of Islamic banks, the mutual funds. If you can see, as per the presentation given with Brother Mehit from the World Bank also, that the investors, the profile of the investors contributing to or invest in the Sukuk issuance, almost 58%, almost 60% coming from Middle East, while 4% only coming from, on a sector-wise, coming from hedge fund or mutual funds or sovereign funds. I think we are missing here something and a lot of good elements, which is we need to concentrate more, having the Islamic financial institutions best role. Without having an Islamic ecosystem, I think we will not be able to build such new models and new mechanisms to contribute to the sustainable development. Thank you very much.
بالإضافة إلى ما ذكره المتحدثان من جوانب فنية مهمة، هناك جوانب مكملة لذلك. أولاً تعريف الصكوك السيادية، لم نسمع تعريفاً لها. الصكوك السيادية هي صكوك تصدرها الحكومات أو المؤسسات الحكومية أو شبه الحكومية، وسميت بهذا الاسم لأنها تتعلق بالدولة ذات السيادة وتختلف عن القطاع الخاص الذي يتمثل في البنوك أو الشركات، وتصدر أيضا هي صكوكا في حالة حاجتها إلى السيولة. إذا نظرنا إلى أهداف الصكوك نجد أنها بمثابة استثمار محلي وطني لإدارة السيولة لدى المؤسسات المالية، وأنها تدعم جهود الحكومة في تحقيق أهدافها التنموية وإيجاد يعني فرص لمعاملات سوق المال عموما والصكوك خصوصا، وتوظيف الحكومة عائدات الصكوك في تمويل مشروعات تنموية تتعلق بالبيئة والاقتصاد. هناك يعني اهتمام شديد بالصكوك في بعض الدول، وخصوصا التي تتطلع إلى أن تكون مركزا ماليا. فمثلا دبي بعد ما أعلنت أنها ستكون مركز مالي للاقتصاد الإسلامي أتبعت هذا بحملة أيضا الاهتمام بالصكوك، وأصدرت أيضا يعني إضافة لذلك أنها ستكون مركزا للصكوك. ويعني تعتبر دبي أكثر النسبة 26% من الصكوك، تتبعها دول أخرى لا نريد الإطالة بها. هناك أيضا هدف آخر وهو تمويل عجز الموازنات لدى الدول، وخصوصا مع انخفاض أسعار البترول. فهذا يعني تستعين الدول بإيجاد موارد مالية من خلال إصدار الصكوك ابتعادا عن القرض بفائدة. هناك طبعا تحريم للقرض بالفائدة. بالإضافة إلى هذا يضيف الفنيون أن القرض بفائدة باهظ التكاليف، وأن هناك فوائد مركبة قد تترتب وتزيد الأعباء على ذلك. أيضا من أهداف الصكوك تشجيع الأجانب إلى الاستثمار في البلد الذي يصدر صكوك. بالإضافة إلى ذلك يعني تحاول أن تسترد الاستثمارات المحلية التي خرجت إلى الخارج، تجذبها وتوجد لهم فرص داخلية. ما هي مزايا الصكوك السيادية بالمقارنة بالصكوك العادية؟ أولا هناك أجهزة حكومية تساعد على إصدار الصكوك. فالدولة لديها مؤسسات ولديها أنشطة ومرافق كثيرة تستطيع أن تخضعها لإصدار الصكوك، وكذلك يتوفر لديها شركات المقاصة والشركات ذات الغرض الخاص، وأيضا توفير الأمان لحملة الصكوك. ولا نقول الضمان، لأنه لا يجوز لمن يصدر الصكوك أن يضمنها، وإنما يشعر الناس بأنها وراء هذه الصكوك دولة، فإذا حصل تعدي أو تقصير وتم تضمين الدولة تستطيع أن تدفع. كذلك عند إطفاء الصكوك ليس هناك مشكلة في البحث عن جهات تشتري هذه الصكوك لإطفائها، لأن الدولة هي راغبة في استرداد هذه الأصول. أيضا سهولة إدراج هذه الصكوك في الأسواق المالية، لأنها تتخطى كثيرا من الإجراءات المطلوبة لإدراج القطاع الخاص. هناك القطاع الخاص يطلب منهم إحضار 3 ميزانيات وأن يكون نسبة كذا كذا. الحكومات لا تطلب منها هذه الإجراءات. أهمية هذه الصكوك أيضا تظهر من بعض الدول أوجدت مؤسسة خاصة لإصدار الصكوك السيادية، وبعض الدول أصدرت قوانين خاصة للصكوك السيادية. وهناك اهتمام عالمي بوجود مركز السيولة في ماليزيا IILM الذي يعنى بالصكوك السيادية ينظمها للدول، وقد عقد عدة ورشات عمل للصكوك السيادية. لا أريد أن أطيل، ولكن أريد أن أقول ما هي الفروق بين الصكوك السيادية والصكوك العادية. أولاً يعني لا يختلف نوعا الصكوك من حيث وجوب الالتزام بالضوابط الشرعية، لأنها يجب أن تكون أداة مشروعة، وهذا غرض أساسي، لأن الصكوك جاءت بدائل عن السندات لتلبي حاجة الشرائح التي لا تتعامل بالربا والتي تلتزم بأحكام الشريعة، خصوصا البنوك الإسلامية وغيرها. لكن في فروق إجرائية، وهذه الفروق الإجرائية تعتبر خصائص أو مزايا للصكوك السيادية. أولا سهولة الترخيص لها لإصدارها، لأنها تصدر عن جهة منوط بها الترخيص، فلا تحتاج إلى يعني تردد في قد يعني الموافقة عليها. الأمر الثاني أنها تتصف بالتصنيف القوي، لأنها تستفيد من تصنيف الدولة. إذا كانت الدولة لها تصنيف اقتصادي، هذه الصكوك تستفيد من هذا الجانب. أيضا غرض هذه الصكوك التنمية وإدارة المرافق وتنميتها، وليس الهدف منها الاسترباح، بينما الصكوك العادية تقدم عليها الجهات المصدرة يعني أحيانا لتستربح من ورائها. الدولة ربحها هو أن تشغل هذه المرافق وتوجد فرص لها. أخيرا سهولة إطفاء هذه الصكوك، لأن الدولة راغبة في الاحتفاظ بالأصول التي أصدرت عليها صكوكا، مثل مؤسسات تربوية، مؤسسات مالية، مؤسسات خدمية، كلها تريد أن تستردها. حين الإطفاء لا نجد مشكلة في البحث عن مشتر ليشتري أصول الصكوك. وهذه النقطة الحقيقة يعني أريد أن أعمقها، وهي كيف تسترد الدولة أصول الصكوك. هناك طريقتان: إما أن تحصل على وعد بالبيع من حملة الصكوك أو من يمثلهم، وهي الشركة ذات الغرض الخاص، فبعد إصدار الصكوك تصدر هذه الشركة الممثلة لحملة الصكوك وعدا خاصا بالبيع لهذه الأصول، وعدا ملزما، فالدولة بهذا تطمئن إلى أنها تستطيع أن تسترجع وتسترد هذه الصكوك. هناك طريقة أخرى، وهي أنه يوجد في الفقه الإسلامي مبدأ، وهو أن الإنسان حينما يبيع شيئا لآخر يمكن أن يشترط عليه، يقول: إذا أردت بيعه فأنا أحق به بالثمن. وهذا أيضا طبقته بعض المؤسسات لاسترداد هذه الأصول. أخيرا أريد أن أشير إلى أن يعني بعض المتحدثين أشاروا إلى أن هناك صكوكا مدعمة أو مدعومة بالأصول. هذه الحقيقة يعني يعني معنى مدعمة أنها هناك أصول مرهونة لهذه الصكوك، وهذا لا يكفي. يجب أن تكون الصكوك تمثل هذه الأصول، تمثل ملكية في هذه الأصول، وليس تدعيما أو رهنا لتحصيل القيمة. أيضا أشار بعض المتحدثين أنه هناك المشاركة فيها مشكلة، أنه لا تعرف أحد الطرفين لا يعرف كم سيقدم رأس المال. هذا سهل جدا، يعني يحدد أحد الطرفين رأس ماله ومشاركته، ويفتح المجال للطرف الآخر لمشاركة وحصة تراكمية عند الحاجة، يعني معلومية الطرفين سهلة. هناك أيضا بالنسبة للتداول ذكرت صكوك السلم وصكوك المرابحة. صكوك المرابحة تمثل ديون نقدية، وصكوك السلم تمثل ديونا سلعية، وكلا هذين النوعين ممنوع تداوله لأنه من قبيل تداول الديون، وتداول الديون لها ضوابط شرعية أن تكون مثلا بمثل، وتداول هذا يعني يتنافى معها. هذا ما أحببت أن أضيفه، وأشكر المتحدثين على ما أفاضا به من بيانات فنية تثري هذا الموضوع، والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Thank you to AOFI for inviting me, and also, mashallah, Mabruk, for 25 years. We are honored to have the Mashayikh here. Sheikh Taqi Usmani is here, and also Sheikh Hussain, Sheikh Abu Ghudda, and other Mashayikh. And we have seen the 2008 crisis when the Sukuk ran into trouble. At the same time, we also saw some rulings coming out of AOFI looking at the Sukuk structure and how those should be implemented. And I would like to highlight some of the challenges which we face in terms of the Sukuk. First, if you see, most of the Sukuk at the domestic level are Murahaba Sukuk. So what you have seen in the last year or so, as pointed out, the Sukuk have dropped. In Malaysia, what we have seen is that actual domestic have dropped. But the international Sukuk, I think the pipeline, if you see, the countries are issuing like non-Islamic, like Luxembourg, like Hong Kong, like South Africa, like UK, and other countries, we have seen interest coming from the international markets as well, and for the international Sukuk, including Muslim countries like Turkey, like Indonesia has picked up, and other countries, including from Pakistan. The main, I think, the issues we face when we sort of looked at in terms of restructuring, when the issue came, all those Sukuks were successfully restructured, and we have seen, that also helped the Sukuk market in terms of its revival. So that was one of the reasons when we saw a sharp drop in 2009 and 2010, and then you saw, because the confidence from the legal perspective came back, we could restructure, although there are issues in restructuring. And I think one critical issue also to look at the SPVs, their roles. This is something I think going forward probably we need to see, because their role is really very administrative. If you see now a new Sukuk issued by Emirates, you will see the Sukuk structure, which has about 3 SPVs doing different roles. I think these are the things which we have to see. And when coming to the quasi-sovereign and sovereign, since crisis, as the respected presenters have mentioned, sovereigns have taken the lead, and also the quasi-sovereign. They are the one who are mostly issuing. We have not seen really corporates coming into the market. Before the crisis, yes, there were corporates who were issuing and driving. So we see a lot of quasi-sovereign also playing their role, like Khazana from Malaysia and other countries are doing. So this is something which we have to see, whether we can improve the role of SPVs when there is a trouble. I hope it doesn't happen, but we are in the real world, and we faces, these difficult times which can come. Then we have to see sometime the underlying assets, whether there are generating profit or not. I think this is another area for us to see. Because the good thing is, which differentiate, as we all know, Sukuk from the bonds, and I think it's very wrong, sometimes I hear people say Islamic bond, it is actually Sukuk. And the main thing is that there is the underlying asset, which is, it differentiate between the bonds. So I think we should be mindful. But then the other challenge is that we don't see sometime, I think, the issues which could be practical, that you don't see income stream coming from the underlying asset itself, although they're alternative. But what I'm trying to say that perhaps this angle can also be looked at. And as I mentioned, I think this is something, new assets is something which we really should look for. and we should try to sort of, bring in more sukuk. I think there's 2-3 areas which I feel where sort of, we are lacking in terms of sukuk if you do the comparison and its potential. We see, exchangeable equities type sukuk for some reason, except Khazana, we have not seen that many. I think that is one thing which we have to see. How can that be perhaps looked at? Other one mentioned was the infrastructure sukuk, which we have seen, but not that many have come in. We have seen few from Sadara, from Saudi Arabia, and few from other countries, including Malaysia. But we have not seen, Indonesia is now, I understand, is looking into it. But that is one area which we have to see. And also, I think now, what you have in terms of sukuk issuances, if you see the tenor, there is an improvement. So you have now up to 30 years sukuk which are coming into the market. I think this is something which is a good development. You see from the bank perspective, from the Basel requirements, since they are in the banking side, so naturally we have to see the regulatory aspects. And we have seen now, looking at tier 1, tier 2 capital and perpetual sukuks. So these are, I think, positive development. Perhaps some of it could be looked at from the sovereign sukuk side also, in my view. And lastly, we have now, if we see the issue of repurchase or repo, naturally, if you structure not everything, you can find solutions which can, not without compromising the Sharia and bank credit. So repo is one product which naturally we cannot have in that form. I don't think so. We are looking into that. We are doing a lot of discussions. But I don't see really in that form you can replicate. But one or two positive development in that front is that we have issued IFM a standard based on AAOIFI principle. I think it's 25 on Rehen. So there is now you can use as a collateral sukuk. So this you can create liquidity because you cannot sell all the time. And I think another area when we are sort of looking at different currencies and in this difficult environment, we are sort of now have hedging products and standard issued by IFM. So these are also, I think, if we go along in terms of the sukuk market, this will also help. But like I said, there are challenges. We have to see, one last point I would like to make is the investors' preference. I think in terms of really if you want to have, I think we have a very low level of asset-backed sukuk. Sheikh Abu Ghudda, mashallah, mentioned that they should be equity type, and we totally agree. But if we also have some, on the asset-backed, issue sometime comes whether you can title transfer and all that legal and expense challenges we have. And the other challenge we see, because investors are used to taking a corporate risk or taking the liability rather than taking the underlying assets and the quality of assets. So if you want to come with asset back, I think we have seen some sort of legal or some investor preferences which also prohibits bringing out asset back. And I think that's another area. Maybe I think we should work collectively to come out with some sukuk at least to increase the level of very low level or non-existent asset backed. So these are some of my observations based on the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hilal. I'd like Dr. Maher, Deputy Governor and our senior financial industry expert, to say something, and then we'll open it up for Q&A to the audience.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. بداية أود أن أشكر الأيوفي على دعوتهم الكريمة لي للمشاركة بهذه الندوة. And actually, I would like to make a few comments based on the presentation and the discussion and the comments from my colleagues in the panel. And that to some extent reflects following up the discussion on the sukuk issue and our limited attempt in Jordan to establish a sovereign sukuk market. We did not succeed yet, but we expect hopefully before the end of this year or early next year, inshallah, to have the first sovereign sukuk issued in the country. And I would like to make maybe 5 or 6 points quickly. Maybe not very much in details related to the presentation, but maybe trying to look, step back and look at the issue of sukuk in general. In most of the discussion, when we hear people trying to make the case for sukuk, we always talk about the available liquidity, those who are interested in investing their saving in compliance with Sharia. Or sometimes when it comes to the government, we also discuss the issue or try to highlight the issue that we would like also to diversify the base for those who provide financing for the government. And there is very little discussion, unfortunately, about the value added of Islamic finance in the form of sukuk. In other words, there is very little discussion how the sukuk could change the way you manage your risk for the issuer and for the saver or investor. It's very much one way to provide financing for the financing need of the government. And in many cases, we cite the fact there is a lot of Islamic banks. They are growing fast. There is a huge liquidity there in GCC countries, in other countries, in saving countries. And this is one way to tap this source of fund. But there is very little discussion why the structure of sukuk is superior to other structures and why the structure of sukuk is appropriate from risk management perspective. And there is very little link between the Sharia aspect of that and risk management. And I can say, or I'm convinced that these elements exist, but there is very little focus on that, and most of the focus actually on the opportunity that exists today, and let's try to take advantage of this opportunity. I think that could help in the short run, but in the long run, it's only when you think that this structure, this finance structure, is viable from risk management perspective that could help promoting the sukuk market in the long run and could invite not only those who are concerned about Sharia compliance, but everybody who have good understanding of risk management and would like to manage the risk in an effective way to be part of this market. There is another point that was raised during the discussion, which is related to the rating, which is quite important, especially with the implementation of Basel III and all these things. But I think there is an equivalent important rating process that needs to be considered when we talk about sukuk, which is Sharia rating. And we face in the past example of sukuk that were issued, and later on, some Sharia scholars criticized the structure of the sukuk, and they say that these are not Sharia compliance sukuk. I think a parallel process that involved also Sharia rating that could help, for example, standardize the Sharia contract, or at least make the market wider, especially from those who are concerned about Sharia compliance. And I come from an environment where I think back home in Jordan, this is an important issue. Not only for sukuk, but it's also quite important even for Islamic banks in the country, when you have some respected scholars say that this is not Sharia compliant. I think globally, it's important that we also think in parallel with sort of Sharia rating, or someone who say this is really Sharia compliant, somebody that is respected significantly. Going back to the first point, the issue of the value added of Sharia compliance structure in terms of risk management, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that even globally, conventional financing is criticized. It's factual that the low interest rate for a long period of time contributed significantly to the global financial crisis. In the US, that resulted in the bubble in the real estate market. In Europe, excessive borrowing from the sovereign, the periphery countries, and now in Asia, in the corporate and household sector. And part of the global reforming agenda, the concept of bail-in, which says that in difficult time, it would be the large creditor who could contribute to deal with the problem of conventional bank. It's part of pass-through, it's part of risk sharing or loss sharing, but it's not symmetrical. It's only one way. So in good time, you don't share profit. In bad time, you share with us losses. So the principles of risk sharing, not in complete form, start to be considered globally as a way to deal with repeated global financial crisis. Unfortunately, in the Islamic banking or Islamic finance part, we still think in the mode of how we can Islamize some of the conventional product and make it easy to replicate in our part of the world, or easy to market. There is an important point that was highlighted by Riyad's presentation about what would be the right approach. Is it using existing assets, like buying and leasing them, and use that to finance government needs? This could be used, and it's used like widely in many countries. But also part of the thinking in the fiscal side, and I think it's now relevant to our region, especially with low oil prices, that financing through sukuk has additional value added, which is if it is done in an appropriate way, it has a value added of making sure that these projects are viable. What I mean by that, for example, you can consider part of your capital spending building a dam in a specific place. If it's not commercially viable, if the feasibility studies say that you will not be able to collect enough water, and if you'd like to do that through sukuk, there is good chance that the process of reviewing this investment will result in the right decision. Don't do that. Actually, our experience in Jordan in the last few years, a lot of projects that was built either PPP or POT were done in a short period of time, lower cost. It's not Sharia compliant, like the financing is not Sharia compliant, but the idea is if you take the capital spending outside the budget or in a specific arrangement with the private sector, you can do it more efficiently with a lower cost. If we think about sukuk, in many and there are, like, if you would like to build a dam, a port, electricity generation, all these things could be done through the private sector and could be done through sukuk, where you are really investing or financing a new asset, and you are sharing to some extent the risk with the government. The government, if you would like to lower the price or to guarantee the return, they can guarantee the price of electricity they're going to buy from you, or the price of water they're going to buy from you. All these arrangements will ensure that at the end of the day, the quality of capital spending is much better than the current status. Because effectively what we are doing, we are investing in commercially, to some extent, commercially viable project, which I think it's an important criteria when it comes to capital spending. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Maher. I think you raised very interesting issues, starting from regulatory, Basel, rating. And I think the next session in the conference after the break talks about rating, some issues related to issuer versus issue rating, asset-backed benefit, etc. And I think what we would like to do is to, I know, Ahmed, you have a few comments to make, but you could just hold, we would like some audience participation. If people could ask questions and restrict them to questions rather than statements, it would be great if anybody has a question for the expert panel and the scholars here. I would welcome their participation. I don't know the arrangement for the mic, so I'll take it myself and bring it here. Is there a microphone? Khairul? Somebody here?
Saeed Ahmed. I'm from State Bank of Pakistan. A very interesting issue raised by Mr. Maher, Deputy Governor of Bank of Jordan, is rating the Sukuk from Sharia point of view. Does it mean that we will say that this, if it's a AAA rated Sharia compliance, it is 100% Sharia compliant? If it is double B or triple B, or then it is Sharia compliant, but it is half-hearted Sharia compliant? I just want to know how would we do that rating?
I'm not an expert, but I think you were trying to distinguish between Sharia rating and credit rating. Risk rating versus the risk of the underlying asset, etc., and separating it from Sharia rating, compliance with Sharia.
Absolutely.
I think that they can be separated, in my view, but Dr. Maher will. Something I'm saying which is not Sharia compliant. Would you like to comment on the separation of credit versus Sharia rating? Sharia rating is for professors and scholars to opine on the structure, and credit is credit. I mean, the government and sovereign credit. Some people have, and this may sound incorrect in an Islamic conference, that credit risk doesn't have a religion. Credit risk is analyzable without, adhering to religious issues or Islamic or Sharia issues. But I think Sharia rating and compliance with asset ownership, etc.
Well, basically, like, this is not a mature idea. It's what I mean is, like, I did not go through the details of that. But basically, what I'm trying to say is that in many cases, people have doubt about Sharia compliance, and investors in this area would like to have a respected body they trust, who can review that and say, at the end of the day, these are financial contracts, and they have a lot of details there. If I am an investor and I'm concerned about if this is Sharia compliant or not, I would like someone to review that and say, yes, this is Sharia compliant. In many cases, the issuer, they have their own Sharia committee. But the problem is the assessment in terms of Sharia compliance of these Sharia committees are not usually, they don't usually have the same level of respect or confidence in their capacity or ability to do that. The Sharia, like the Sharia rating would come, or I'm not sure if we should call it rating or not, but the Sharia review process would come and say, well, this contract, for example, is in line with AAOIFI standard, let's say, from all perspective. Or this contract has this 1 or 2 or 3 issues. Maybe it's acceptable in specific jurisdiction, it's not acceptable in others, or it's acceptable for specific investors or not. But I think this review would be an important part of the process of standardizing the contract and making the acceptance wider compared to the current structure.
بالنسبة للتصنيف، يعني جدير بالذكر أن هناك في هذا البلد وكالة دولية إسلامية للتصنيف، وقد نشأت بعناية البنك الإسلامي للتنمية منذ 10 سنوات تقريبا، وصنفت كثيرا من البنوك والمنتجات الإسلامية ومنها الصكوك، ووضع هناك شكلت لجنة فيها الدكتور محمد علي القري والشيخ نظام يعقوبي وأنا، ووضعنا منهجا للتصنيف، نقاط هذه الصكوك لها هيئة شرعية، هل هي تمثل أصولا مقبولة شرعا، هل فيها جوانب محرمة، وهذا المنهج. وكان معنا محكمون من الخارج، منهم الدكتور حسين حامد وآخرون، كانوا ينظرون في بيانات أي شركة أو أي منتج، سواء كان صندوق استثماري أو صكوك، ويضعون لها نقاط ويقولون هذه تستحق من الجانب الشرعي كذا. وكان وجود هذه الوكالة ضروريا، لأن الوكالات التصنيف العالمية لا تأخذ في الاعتبار هذا الجانب الشرعي، وإنما تركز على الملاءة والضمان وغيرها من الأمور.
استخدم يعني إلى أي مدى المصدرين الصكوك بيرجعوا لهذه الوكالة؟
البنوك الإسلامية دخلت يعني رجعت إلى هذه الوكالة، ومنها بنك البركة، مجموعة البركة التي تضم 11 بنكا دخلت إلى هذه الوكالة وطلبت تصنيفا. ولا أتذكر، يمكن الدكتور القري يتذكر كم من الشركات يا دكتور محمد يعني دخلت في هذا المجال، ومنتجات كثيرة متعددة. ويعني لبثنا فترة إلى أن استقر نما سوقها وبدأت تعمل بهذه النمطية وهذا المنهج. ستؤجل الجواب.
أؤجل الجواب إلى الجلسة الجاية حتى أجد ما أقول وأنا رئيس تلك الجلسة. أوكي. سلام. مايكين مش هيك؟ أنا الأستاذ غياث، لما حكينا على الأصول السيادية إنه في إشكالية وقد تستدعي تغيير القانون، خاصة إنه الملكيات العامة لا تقبل إنه يكون في شركاء فيها. الآن ألا يمكن أن نستفيد من العقود التي طرحها الفقهاء لاستثمار الوقف؟ فالوقف في إشكالية في بيعه أعقد من الملكية العامة، مع ذلك الفقهاء وجدوا عقود استثمار زي حق التحكير والقرار والإجارتين، بحيث أنه تستثمر وإذا فشل المشروع فلا يباع الأصل، إنما يباع حق الحكر، فحق المحكر هو الذي يباع، إنما يبقى الأصل للوقف. فبالتالي يعني ممكن إحنا نطور هذه العقود بحيث أنه نستخدمها في الصكوك السيادية بصيغ لا تؤدي إلى بيع الأصل الحكومي، إنما بيع الحق الاستثمار فيه كما كان في العقارات الوقفية، لأنه تغيير القانون أو فتح مجال لبيع الملكيات العامة أو إدخال مستثمرين أجانب فيها قد يكون مفسدة عظيمة وباب شر في ظل عالم ثالث وديون وعجز متراكم في الموازنة. نصبح يوما فإذا بالبلاد والعباد مبيوعين. وشكرا.
لا طبعا انا ما يعني قصدت انه لابد من تغيير القانون. هذا الواقع، يعني كثير من الدول اللي تريد اصدار صكوك سياديه تجبر في النهايه على تغيير القانون، لأن القانون لا يسمح باستخدام الأملاك الحكومية، مش بيعها حتى، مجرد وضعها في صندوق قد لا يسمح القانون بذلك، فتضطر هذه الدول إلى تغيير القانون، وهذا حصل في كثير من الدول. بس يعني أنت الآن ذكرت خيارين، إما تغيير القانون أو تطوير العقود. أعطي خيار ثالث لا تحتاج إلى أي منهما. الخيار الأبسط انك ما تحتاج لتغيير القانون، والخيار الابسط انك ما تحتاج الى تطوير عقود، تستخدم العقود الموجوده البسيطه، وهذا متوفر وحاصل يعني. فنحن الدعوه الان الدعوه الى تبسيط الامر وعدم الدخول الى تعقيدات نقل ملكيه الدوله، وعدم الدخول في تعقيدات ايجاد عقود مستحدثه لتجاوز العقبات استخدام الاصول الموجوده. في حال انتقلت الى استخدام نموذج للصكوك يعتمد على الاصول، على استحواذ الاصول وخلق الاصول.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I have two quick questions. One of them is regarding the ecosystem to support asset-backed sukuk. Normally, we mentioned that a large percentage of these sukuk are invested by Islamic banks. And Islamic banks, we know the way that they invest mainly are driven by the credit ratings. of the sukuk. If it's an asset-backed sukuk, how will these be rated, or will they be rated? And if they're not going to be rated, do you think that that will be a problem for Islamic banks to invest, to do the necessary analysis of these sukuk? This is the first question. The second one is regarding new asset sukuk. Typically, because I work in Saudi Arabia and I see almost all project finance is using the structures of forward lease and istisna. And in this case, the period of the asset construction, the sukuk remains a debt. It's only after the asset is finished that you have the real assets on the ground owned by the sukuk holders. So my question is about tradability during the construction period, whether this would this be a hindrance? Would it be tradable during the construction period? And if not, would this be a hindrance to this being more popular?
Thank you very much. Let me start with the second question. I think there's a lot of technical details there, and I would be happy to discuss it bilaterally, but I don't think there is an issue there, and there is a standard fatwa for that, but maybe you can also refer to our fuqaha. But let me go back to your first question, which is a very important question. Why is it that the majority of the sukuk are the investors are only the Islamic investors? Why the rest of the conventional investment community are not investing in these, except hedge funds, ironically? Well, I mean, for me, this is a failure for sukuk, big failure for sukuk. Sukuk should not be issued to be invested by Islamic investors only. It should be issued by be invested by everybody, whether they're Islamic investors or not. You want to mobilize funding for yourself, and then you need to do it from all sources in a Sharia way. It doesn't make a difference. Now, that failure reflects really the difficulties and the failures we see when we are using the existing asset structures. Now, if I'm a conventional investor, you come to me, you give me an asset that looks, smells, feels like a government bond, like a conventional bond, conventional instrument, but far more complex, with lots of documentation, lots of interesting issues, lots of things that I don't understand. And you're telling me, well, why don't you buy it? Like we discussed yesterday with Brother Ansari, when your lawyer presents you with a checklist, they look the same, all of them. Why should I buy it? I will not buy it. The only reason conventional investors will start buying Islamic financial instruments if they are different. Differentiation, being different, is what integrates Islamic finance in the conventional finance, not by being the same. Because being different present to the conventional investor different opportunities in terms of risk management, risk profile, in terms of return, liquidity, and so on, and that is attractive for conventional investors. And it is very critical. I mean, there's a lot of discussion, how do we integrate the Islamic finance in the global financial sector? Yes, you can be integrated, and you should be integrated, but you can be integrated by being different, not by being the same. Otherwise, there is no point, there is no value added. By being different, meaning you stick to your Islamic finance principle that you are advocating, and by doing that, you are creating a different investment environment that many may find attractive. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
أنا أؤكد على ما لاحظه الدكتور عبد الستار بغدة. فكرة asset based وasset backed ليس لها أصل في الشريعة بإجماع فقهاء العصر. وبالنسبة لصكوك الذي تقتضي نقل ملكية الأصل إلى حملة الصكوك لا بد من نقل الملكية، ولا نجد أي رأي لا قديما ولا حديثا ولا شاذا ولا ضعيفا يجيز أن تصدر صكوك لا يتملك فيها حملة الصكوك الأصل. فإحنا نريد أن ننقي الصناعة، ولنا 100 حل. إذا أغلق الله بابا للحرام فتح للحلال 100 باب، وإحنا ممكن نجتهد. في صدور صدرت فعلا خلينا البائع التايتل موجود، لأن القانون يمنع نقل الملكية، يعني الملكية نقصد التسجيل، يعني لأن فعلا في كل الصكوك التي صدرت فيه عقود بيع، والبيع بإجماع فقهاء المسلمين منذ 14 قرنا ينقل الملك بنفسه ولو لم يكتب، لكن هو عقد بيع مكتوب ينقل الملك. الكلام كان في التسجيل، لأن قوانين النافذة تقول إن الملكية لا تنتقل أو لا يحتج بها على طرف ثالث إلا بالتسجيل. إحنا جعلنا التايتل، جعلنا البائع، أبقينا التايتل باسم البائع، واعتبرنا إنه بيعطينا تايتل، بيدينا ديد اوف تراست اند ايجنسي. يعني مثلا في صكوك صدرت في باكستان، في بلاد لا تعطي حق تملك العقارات لغير المواطنين، ففي حلول. في تراست، في تو تراستيز، الاس بي في والمالك اللي بقي التايتل في اسمه، يعني ويعطي ديد اوف تراست اند ايجنسي. ولمين؟ للاس بي في، والاس بي في بدورها تكون هي تراستي اند ايجنت ايشور وهكذا. فالجزئيه دي نريد ان نتخلص منها ونتبنى حلولا. يعني في قانون الصكوك في مصر اللي صدر، احنا اكتفينا في اخر اني نقل الملكيه الذي يقتضيه القانون بالتسجيل في إصدارات الصكوك ليس ضروريا. يعني قانون الصكوك نفسه قال بالنسبة لإصدارات الصكوك لا يحتاج إلى التسجيل، يعني تنتقل الملكية بمجرد يعني الإصدار الصك وبمجرد نشرة الإصدار المعتمدة من الجهات المختصة. الملاحظة الثانية إني أنا أعجبني جدا الناظر في الفقه الإسلامي. طبعا كل الصكوك في underlying contracts، يعني عقود، هي ما فيش صك يصدر إلا ويصدر بناء على عقد شرعي. الحقيقة إن الصكوك بالنسبة الحكومية بالذات هي صكوك to create assets حقيقة، لأنها الحكومة عاوزة تنمية وعاوزة استثمار، فبتصدر صكوك مشاركة، هي الشريك المدير، بتصدر صكوك مضاربة، صكوك وكالة بالاستثمار، وبالتالي ما فيش بيع ولا شراء، إنما فيه مشاركة. مش محتاجين يعني مشكلة نقل الملكية إلى آخر. إنما صكوك البيع سواء كان بيع استصناع أو بيع سلم أو بيع عادي مرابحة، دي ثانوية جدا، ثانوية، والحكومة إذا احتاجتها يعني لا ينبغي في نظري، أنا لا أتكلم من الناحية الشرعية إنما أتكلم من الناحية الفيابيليتي، ما يصحش، مش هي دي شغلتها. شغلتها عندها أسيتس وتريد أن تنميها وتنمي مشاريعها، فعندما تصدر صكوك مشاركة ومضاربة ووكالة عشان تنمي المشاريع وتوجد نيو أسيتس، وده المقصود والمطلوب، وجميع الحكومات تستطيع أن تفعل ذلك. والواقع أن ما هو يعني أسهل هو أنفع. وشكرا.
Thank you very much, sir. I think that you obviously touched on very complex issues related to ownership of assets, like Dr. Maher mentioned, development assets like dams and roads and highways. They don't have economic, commercial value, so it's very difficult to give ownership to the private sector. And then strategic assets, where you don't want to give to foreigners and other. So it's a very complex subject. I think that we cannot exhaust it in 2 hours. I thank you for participation, Dr. Khair, Murad, Dr. Maher, Dr. Sattar, Ahmed. I know you still have some comments. You should say it bilaterally to people. And Islal, thank you very much. Thanks a lot.